My life had become a series of routines, predictable, unremarkable, and comforting in their own way. Mornings began with the whistle of my old kettle, the chipped porcelain mug warming my hands as I watched the world wake up outside my kitchen window. Afternoons were reserved for errands. The bank on Tuesdays, the post office on Thursdays, and the grocery store every Saturday without fail. It wasn't always this quiet. There had been love once, a marriage that lasted 25 years, though it ended not with fireworks or fury, but with a quiet unraveling. My 2 daughters were grown now, thriving in cities far from this small, sleepy town. They called often, always worried about how I was adjusting to being alone. I always assured them I was fine. Truthfully, I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. It was on one of those ordinary Saturdays at the grocery store that something shifted. I was standing in the produce aisle, deliberating over the ripeness of tomatoes, when I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you think these avocados are ready?" I turned to see a man who couldn't have been more than 30. His dark hair curled just slightly at the ends, and his smile was disarmingly warm. He held up 2 avocados as though they were ancient artifacts he couldn't decipher. I smiled politely, surprised that he'd addressed me, and offered my opinion. Showing him how to feel for just the right, he listened attentively, nodding with an exaggerated seriousness that made me chuckle despite myself. "You're a lifesaver," he said, his grin widening. "I'm trying to impress someone with guacamole. Now I won't embarrass myself, at least not with the avocados." I smiled, the corners of my lips lifting in a way they hadn't in years. "Well, I hope your guacamole wins them over." He laughed. "I'll let you know how it goes." And then he was gone, disappearing down the aisle with a basket slung over his arm. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a brief exchange with a polite stranger. Yet as I moved through the store, I found myself scanning the aisles, wondering if I'd see him again. To my surprise, I did. Near the bakery section of all places. He was squinting at a label, looking as perplexed as he had with the avocados. "I'm starting to think grocery shopping isn't your strong suit," I teased, before I could stop myself. He turned, clearly startled, but when he saw me, that smile returned, as easy and genuine as before. Guilty as charged. Bread flour versus all-purpose flour. Who knew baking required a degree in chemistry? I gave him a few tips, and before long, we were chatting as though we'd known each other for years. His name, I learned, was Adam. He had recently moved to town for work, leaving behind a bustling city life to embrace the quiet charm of this place. "Is it everything you hoped for?" I asked, curious about his answer. "It's different," he said after a moment. "But good. People are kinder here. And the air smells like actual trees instead of exhaust fumes." His words lingered with me as I drove home that day. There was a lightness in my chest that I couldn't quite explain, a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine streaming through my windshield. It was as though someone had pulled open a curtain in my carefully contained world, letting in a little more light. I told myself it was nothing, a pleasant interaction that would fade into memory by next Saturday. But Adam was not so easily forgotten. The following Saturday, I walked into the grocery store with an unusual sense of anticipation. I told myself it was silly to hope to see him again after all. It was a chance encounter in a small town. But there he was, standing in front of the pasta aisle, examining 2 different jars of marinara sauce as if the fate of the world depended on his choice. Still undecided, I asked, a smile tugging at my lips. He turned, startled at first, but when recognition lit his face he laughed. "It's you, the avocado expert. Maybe you're destined to save me from food-related disasters. Maybe you're destined to give me material for a book about hapless cooks," I quipped. From that moment on, the pattern was set. Each Saturday, we'd somehow find each other, whether in front of the dairy case, debating the merits of whole milk versus almond milk, or in the cereal aisle, where he made an impassioned defense of why marshmallows absolutely belonged in breakfast. Adam had a way of making the mundane feel extraordinary. He was funny, self-deprecating, and unabashedly curious about everything, from my favorite recipes to my thoughts on the best way to spend a rainy afternoon. He didn't just ask questions, he listened, as though my answers mattered more than anything else in the world. Our conversations began to stretch beyond groceries. He told me about his job as a graphic designer, his failed attempts at keeping houseplants alive, and his dream of one day opening an art gallery. I told him about my daughters, my late-night hobbies of painting and gardening, and the book club I half-heartedly attended once a month. The loneliness I'd grown so used to began to feel less like a permanent state and more like a fog that was lifting. I hadn't laughed this freely in years, and it was all because of Adam. One Saturday, as we stood outside the store, bags in hand, he asked if I wanted to grab a coffee. I hesitated. There was laundry waiting at home, a list of chores I'd been meaning to tackle. But the way he looked at me, hopeful and unassuming, made it impossible to say no. Over steaming cups of cappuccino at a cozy cafe down the street, I found myself sharing more than I ever expected. He asked about my marriage, and for the first time in years, I spoke about it without bitterness. He talked about his own relationships, his voice tinged with the kind of wistfulness that comes from lessons learned too late. By the time we left the cafe, the sun was setting, painting the town in soft hues of gold and rose. He walked me to my car, hands shoved in his pockets, and said, "I'm glad we met, you know. You make this place feel more like home." I smiled, my chest tightening with something I couldn't quite name. "I'm glad we met, too." Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my mind. It was just a friendship, I told myself, a lovely, unexpected connection in the middle of a quiet life. But deep down, I knew it was becoming something more that I first noticed it one evening while pruning my overgrown roses. The memory of Adam's laugh, rich and full, like sunlight spilling into a room, lingered longer than it should have. My mind wandered back to our conversations, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the warmth in his voice when he asked about my favorite books. At first, I brushed it off as idle fondness, the kind you feel for anyone who brings light into your life. But it wasn't that simple. There was something else, something deeper and unspoken. I tried to ignore it, pushing the thoughts away with a ferocity that startled me. I was 54, a woman of experience and practicality. What business did I have feeling this way about a man who wasn't even 35? Society had made it clear. Women like me were supposed to fade into the background, not dream of love that felt impossible. Yet the feelings persisted. It hit me fully one afternoon while sorting through an old box of photos. I stumbled upon a picture of myself in my 20s, standing next to my late husband, smiling at the camera with a naivety I no longer possessed. I barely recognized the young woman in the photo. She seemed so sure of her place in the world, so certain of the path ahead. What startled me wasn't how much I'd changed, but how alive Adam made me feel in comparison to that girl. With him, I felt seen, as though the world hadn't entirely forgotten me after all. But with that realization came fear of rejection, fear of judgment, and most of all, fear of losing the precious friendship we'd built. I replayed every moment between us, analyzing his words, his gestures, searching for some clue that he might feel the same. But even if he did, would it matter? Could I let myself risk the inevitable scrutiny of others, or the heartbreak that might follow if this was all one-sided? That night, I stood at the bathroom sink, brushing my hair and staring at my reflection. My hands trembled slightly as I tucked a strand of silver away. I didn't look young, but for the first time in years I didn't mind. Adam had made me feel beautiful, even if he'd never said the words. I set the brush down, my heart heavy with unanswered questions. It wasn't just the idea of him that scared me, it was the possibility of change. Falling in love at my age wasn't just unexpected. It felt like stepping into uncharted territory without a map. The thought left me breathless, equal parts exhilarated and terrified. What if I let myself feel this fully again? What if I opened myself up to him and found only heartbreak waiting? But even as I tried to push the thoughts away, one thing was undeniable. Adam had awakened something in me, a yearning I hadn't felt in decades. It was no longer a question of whether I had feelings for him. It was a question of what I was going to do about them. The next week, as I wandered the grocery aisles, I couldn't focus. My usual rhythm, scan the shelves, compare prices, choose the freshest produce, was interrupted by thoughts of Adam. I half expected to see him at every turn, his easy smile dissolving the uncertainty swirling in my chest. And then there he was in the bakery section again, holding a baguette like it was a delicate relic. He caught my eye and grinned, lifting the bread in greeting. Back for another rescue mission. I laughed, a little too loudly, and closed the distance between us. I'm starting to think you get lost in grocery stores on purpose. Guilty, he said, chuckling. But I'm not just here for bread. I was hoping I'd run into you. His words sent a jolt through me, my breath catching before I forced myself to respond. Oh, why's that? I was wondering if you'd help me with something. I've been wanting to try cooking more, and I figure who better to teach me than the queen of avocados and flour. His tone was light, teasing, but his eyes held something else, something earnest. For a moment I was frozen. It wasn't just the invitation, it was what it represented. A chance to spend more time together, to bridge the growing connection between us, but also a risk. Saying yes meant stepping closer to the feelings I was barely ready to admit to myself. I'd be happy to help, I finally said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. But fair warning, I might not be the best teacher. I'm a terrible student, so we'll balance each other out, he quipped, and I couldn't help but laugh. We exchanged phone numbers before parting, and as I drove home, I couldn't stop glancing at my phone, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. 2 days later, his text arrived. Adam, hope you're ready to teach me your secrets. Saturday evening work? I'll provide the kitchen and the wine. I stared at the message for longer than I cared to admit, my thumb hovering over the screen. My heart warred with my head, one urging me to leap, the other cautioning me to stay firmly on the ground. But then I remembered how he made me feel. Alive, seen, and more than just a woman defined by her age or her past. And so, with a deep breath, I typed back, Me. Saturday sounds perfect. Just don't blame me if your kitchen ends up a disaster. The rest of the week passed in a blur of nerves and anticipation. By the time Saturday arrived, I had overthought every detail, from the casual blouse I chose to the way I styled my hair. When I knocked on his door, holding a small bag of ingredients, I felt like a teenager on her first date. He opened the door, his face lighting up in that way that had become so familiar. You came prepared. I'm impressed. And a little terrified, I admitted, stepping inside. Well, that makes 2 of us, he said softly, his gaze lingering on mine for just a moment longer than necessary. The evening stretched ahead of us, full of promise and uncertainty. Little did I know, it would become a turning point. I could never have anticipated. Adam's apartment was cozy, the kind of place that felt welcoming from the moment you stepped inside. The soft glow of warm light spilled across the hardwood floors, and the scent of garlic and herbs filled the air. I immediately felt at ease, like I had stepped into a space that was as much mine as it was his. We fell into a rhythm, chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, laughing at the way I insisted on following recipes down to the last detail. He, on the other hand, was a bit more improvisational, throwing in a pinch of this and a dash of that, all the while making jokes about his creative cooking techniques. We shared stories as we worked, our conversation flowing effortlessly. He told me about his childhood in a bustling city, how he'd grown up surrounded by noise and people but had always longed for the peace of a smaller town. I shared memories of my own, stories about my daughters, and the way the house used to feel when it was full of life. As we plated the food, I couldn't help but notice how easily we slipped into a comfortable intimacy. His proximity no longer felt like a simple friendship. It felt different, charged, like the air between us had thickened in the best possible way. We sat at the small dining table, the meal in front of us a mixture of our combined efforts. It was delicious, but it was the shared silence between bites that spoke the loudest. There was something there, something unspoken but undeniable. Adam's eyes met mine over the rim of his wine glass. He smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made my heart flutter unexpectedly. I'm really glad you came tonight. Me too, I replied, my voice a little softer than I intended. The moment hung in the air, suspended between us, fragile and full of possibility. And then, without thinking, I did what I hadn't been able to do before. I leaned across the table, reached out, and brushed my fingers against his hand. He didn't pull away. Instead, he held my gaze, his eyes dark with something more than simple affection. It was longing, tenderness, and something else, something I couldn't quite put into words but recognized instantly. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he moved his hand to meet mine, fingers interlacing in a way that felt both familiar and brand new. The world seemed to stop in that moment, the sound of our breathing the only thing that filled the space between us. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt a rush of emotions I wasn't prepared for. There was a fleeting moment of hesitation, a voice in my head whispering that I should pull away, that this was too much, too soon. But the other part of me, the part that had been waiting for this moment for far too long, told me to stay, to lean in, to let myself feel, even if it scared me. And then, just as the space between us seemed to shrink to nothing, he whispered, "Is this okay?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but the certainty behind it was unmistakable. Before I could say anything more, he leaned in, just enough to close the distance between us. His lips met mine gently at first, a soft brush of contact that spoke volumes. And in that simple kiss, everything I had been holding back, all the fear, the uncertainty, the longing, melted away. When we finally broke apart, we both sat there for a moment, speechless, the reality of what had just happened settling in around us. But I didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. The next few days felt like a blur of emotions, each one more intense than the last. I could still feel the warmth of Adam's hand in mine, the softness of his lips lingering in my memory. It was as if everything had shifted overnight, and my world was no longer as simple as it had once been. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about us, but with that new excitement came a flood of questions. What did this mean? Was this just a moment of weakness, a temporary lapse in judgment, or was this the beginning of something real? Was I ready to dive into him, with everything I had? I spent days wrestling with those questions, trying to find clarity. The world outside felt unchanged, as though life was moving forward without acknowledging the shift that had taken place within me. The usual rhythm of my days was still there, the quiet mornings, the unhurried afternoons. But now, there was an undercurrent of something else, a pulse of energy, a sense of possibility. I hadn't heard from Adam since that night, and my mind kept replaying the kiss, overanalyzing every detail. It wasn't like him to leave things unspoken. He had always been open, communicative, and I couldn't help but wonder if he regretted it. Maybe it had been a mistake for him, a fleeting moment he now wished hadn't happened. I told myself not to read too much into it, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. And yet, I couldn't ignore the fact that I wanted more. More of the moments we'd shared, more of his laughter, his touch, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. Then, one evening, as I sat with a glass of wine in hand, my phone buzzed. "Adam, I've been thinking about you, about what happened. I don't want to make things awkward between us, but I also don't want to pretend like it didn't mean something." I held my breath as I read his message, my heart quickening in my chest. It didn't make things awkward, Adam. If anything, it made me realize how much I enjoy being around you. And I think it meant something, too. The seconds that passed before his reply felt like an eternity. But when it came, it was worth the wait. "Adam, I'm relieved. I've never been so unsure of anything in my life, but I know what I feel when I'm with you. I just wanted to be sure it wasn't just me." And just like that, the walls I had been building up around myself began to crumble. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to second-guess myself, to worry about what was or wasn't acceptable. I could feel my heart opening, cautiously at first, but more and more with each passing moment. This was new, unfamiliar territory, but with Adam, I felt like I had someone I could trust to navigate it with me. The next time we saw each other, there were no more games, no more hesitation, just a quiet certainty that whatever this was, it was worth pursuing. He came to my house and we spent the evening talking, really talking, about everything that mattered. Our fears, our desires, our pasts. And as the night wore on, our kisses were no longer hesitant but full of purpose. I had no idea where this would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid to find out that in the weeks that followed, the world outside seemed to quiet, like a background hum to the symphony that was playing between Adam and me. Our connection deepened, but it wasn't just the passion or the tenderness we shared. It was the way we had come to understand each other in a way that felt ancient, like two souls who had been waiting for each other, even if they hadn't known it until now. I had moments of doubt, of course. There were times when the weight of the age difference seemed heavier than it had before, When I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror and wonder if I was being foolish. I'd ask myself if I was just chasing something I had lost in my youth, or if I was truly building something with Adam, something real, something lasting. But in those moments, all I had to do was look at him, to feel his hand in mine, steady and sure, and I knew. I knew that love wasn't confined by years or expectations. It wasn't about when you met someone or how long you'd been alive. Love, true love, was about the way you made each other feel. It was about understanding, about growing together, about learning how to give and receive in a way that nourished both hearts. We talked about the future, about what we wanted, what we dreamed of. There were no promises of forever, but the way we held each other's gaze made me believe that if we had forever, we'd know how to make it work. I began to accept my feelings without fear, without guilt. And Adam, he was patient with me, never rushing, never making me feel like I was taking too long to get there. His presence in my life was a quiet reassurance that, no matter what the world thought or said, we had something worth holding on to. One afternoon, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Adam turned to me with a question in his eyes. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we weren't so different in age?" I smiled, squeezing his hand. "I think about it sometimes. But then I realize it's not the years that matter, it's the moments. The way we make each other feel." He nodded, and in the silence that followed, there was an understanding between us. An understanding that, despite what the world might say, love was love. And we had found it in the most unexpected of places. Looking at Adam, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. I had spent so many years thinking that love had passed me by, that it was something for younger women, something for people with fewer miles behind them. But now I understood. Love didn't belong to any age or time. It was a force that could happen at any moment, at any stage in life, if you were brave enough to recognize it. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was ready for whatever came next, as long as it was with him. And for the first time in many years, I wasn't afraid.